The winter of 1841 in Hartford was a season that held both promise and peril. The Connecticut River had frozen thick and silver, the streets carried the sound of horses' hooves over ice, and the townspeople huddled by their stoves whispering tales that moved faster than the wind. It was in that season of candlelit parlors and half-frozen orchards that the Channing household prepared for what should have been a joyous celebration. The wedding of Jonathan Channing, the eldest son of one of Hartford's most respected families, to Miss Eleanor Price, the daughter of a merchant from Providence. The Channings had lived in Hartford for 3 generations. Their home stood tall on Asylum Avenue, its white clapboard exterior glowing against the snowdrifts that gathered by the garden wall. Samuel Channing, the patriarch, was a man of trade and influence, stern but well regarded, and his wife Margaret was known less for her kindness than for her unbending will. She ruled the household with sharp words and sharper glances. To the servants, she was feared, to neighbors, she was tolerated, and to her children, she was both protector and gaoler. Jonathan, at 26, was handsome, reserved, and ambitious. He had been groomed to follow his father into business, but he carried a gentleness in his nature that softened his otherwise imposing presence. When he met Eleanor Price at a summer gathering in Providence, something in her manner, graceful yet spirited, drew him to her instantly. They courted in earnest through the year, exchanging letters inked with sincerity, and by autumn, the banns were announced. But not everyone rejoiced. Margaret Channing had long envisioned another match for her son, a union that would secure alliances with a family of standing within Hartford society. Eleanor, though well-bred and of decent means, was an outsider, a girl from Rhode Island whose arrival threatened Margaret's careful designs. She masked her disapproval behind brittle smiles and stiff embraces, but those close to her noticed the coldness that trailed her words whenever Eleanor's name was spoken. The days following Jonathan's public accusation tore through Hartford like a winter storm. Gossip no longer whispered behind closed doors, but shouted in markets and echoed in taverns. Some townsfolk clutched their crosses, horrified that a mother could commit such an unholy act. Others scoffed, claiming grief had turned Jonathan against his own flesh. But whether they believed or not, all agreed on one thing: the Channing family was undone. Margaret did not hide. She appeared in public within days, wrapped in her fur-lined cloak, her back straight, her face calm. She walked into church the next Sunday, beneath the scrutiny of every eye, bowed her head at the prayers, and sang the hymns with unwavering voice. When approached with questions, she replied only, "My son suffers greatly. I forgive his words." The sheer audacity of her composure unsettled even her defenders. At home, the atmosphere grew unbearable. Samuel raged at Jonathan, demanding he retract his accusation, but Jonathan stood firm. "I will not protect her with silence," he said. Eleanor's blood cries for justice. Margaret, meanwhile, regarded him with a serenity that chilled him to his core, as though she believed time itself would bend the town back to her side. An inquiry was inevitable. The magistrates, pressured by public unrest and Thomas Price's relentless demands, agreed to hear the matter. Eleanor's body, already examined once, was brought forth again under official authority. This time, the findings were declared openly arsenic, beyond question. The source could not be traced with certainty, but the timing of her illness and the testimony of servants regarding the cordial Margaret had often painted a damning picture. The trial that followed was the most attended Hartford had ever seen. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, their breath steaming in the cold, jostling to glimpse the proud matron accused of murdering her daughter-in-law. Inside, the proceedings unfolded with grim ceremony. Thomas Price testified with fury, recounting Eleanor's final hours and Margaret's disdain for the marriage. Servants spoke of powders hidden in her locked box, of purchases made at the apothecary. The physician described the symptoms with clinical precision, his voice carrying the weight of science. Margaret, when her turn came, rose with dignity. Her words were calm, deliberate, and chillingly persuasive. She insisted Eleanor's death was the result of illness, a tragic misfortune twisted by grief, stricken minds into malice. She denied offering any special cordial, claiming all guests were served from the same bowl. Her gaze swept the courtroom, her voice steady. "I am a mother," she said, "and a mother does not kill. My son is broken by sorrow. I grieve for his pain, but his grief does not make me a murderer." The courtroom murmured. Some nodded, swayed by her composure. Others shook their heads, remembering Eleanor's sudden agony. Jonathan sat rigid, his hands clenched, his soul torn as his mother's words sought to erase the truth he had uncovered. When the verdict came, it stunned the town. The evidence, though strong in suspicion, lacked the definitive link to place the poison directly in Margaret's hand. Without eyewitness testimony, without proof beyond doubt, the magistrates declared her not guilty. Gasps filled the hall. Some wept in outrage, others sighed in relief. Margaret left the courthouse free, her expression unreadable, her composure intact. But freedom did not restore her standing. Though the law had acquitted her, Hartford society did not. Invitations ceased. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid her. Servants whispered in fear. She remained in the Channing home, but its halls grew cold with silence. Samuel retreated into bitterness, his business faltering under the shadow of scandal. Jonathan, unable to remain under the same roof as the woman he believed had murdered his wife, left Hartford altogether, moving north in search of peace that never came. As for Margaret, she aged swiftly in the years that followed. The once commanding matron became a figure of eerie solitude, her windows shuttered, her steps echoing in empty rooms. Children in Hartford whispered that the Channing house was haunted, that the ghost of the poisoned bride wandered its halls, her faint sobs heard on winter nights. Some claimed to see Margaret standing in the upstairs window, staring into the snow, her face pale as bone. Jonathan never returned. He wrote rarely, and when he did, his words were brief, strained, as though the memory of Hartford itself weighed upon him. He never remarried. To the end of his days, he carried Eleanor's name upon his lips, a prayer and a curse entwined. Margaret died quietly in her chamber, the walnut box still locked at her bedside. When at last it was opened, years later, those who pried it apart found only traces of powders long turned to dust. What they had once been, no one could say with certainty. But the suspicions never died. Hartford remembered. The tale of the wedding-turned-funeral, of the bride poisoned and the mother acquitted, became a story told by candlelight, passed from one generation to the next. Some spoke of Margaret as a monster cloaked in piety, others as a victim of rumor and envy. But for Jonathan, wherever he walked, the truth was unshakable. Eleanor had been stolen from him by the hand of the woman who should have cherished her. And so the Channing name, once spoken with respect, lingered in Hartford's memory as a cautionary tale. Wealth, status, and reputation could silence courts and sway neighbors, but not the whisper of guilt carried on winter winds. Even as the decades passed, when snow fell heavy and the church bells tolled, the people of Hartford would say, "Do you hear it? That is the sound of the tragic wedding, when love was poisoned by blood." The story ended not in justice nor redemption, but in the haunting certainty that evil can wear the face of family, and love can be twisted into the cruelest weapon. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a flurry of activity. Dressmakers stitched gowns by candlelight, florists prepared garlands of winter greenery, and the Channing home filled with the scent of spices and evergreens. Yet beneath the festivity ran an undercurrent of unease. Eleanor confided to her closest friend that she felt watched whenever she stepped into the Channing house. She described Margaret's eyes following her movements, her questions framed in politeness but heavy with judgment. Jonathan dismissed his fiancée's fears, insisting his mother merely needed time to accept what was inevitable. The day of the wedding dawned pale and bright, the sky brushed with thin clouds that promised snow by evening. Guests gathered in the First Church of Christ, their breath fogging in the frosted air. Eleanor arrived draped in ivory silk, a gown brought from Boston, her cheeks flushed with the cold and the nervous thrill of the moment. She looked radiant, a vision that hushed the congregation as she walked down the aisle. Jonathan stood waiting, his eyes lit with devotion that softened the severity of his features. The ceremony passed without incident, vows exchanged, rings placed, and the echo of the organ filling the church as husband and wife made their way out into the winter light. The reception was held at the Channing home, where servants bustled and candles blazed in every room. Tables groaned under the weight of roasts, pastries, and mulled wine. Laughter rang through the halls as music swelled, and for a time, Eleanor felt the warmth of welcome. Margaret herself moved through the crowd with practiced grace, her smile taut but convincing, her voice pitched sweetly as she offered guests slices of cake and cups of spiced punch. It was with that same smile that she approached Eleanor. The bride, flushed from dancing, paused to accept a drink from her new mother-in-law's hand. It was a delicate glass filled with a cordial Margaret claimed was a family recipe, brewed with herbs to soothe and refresh. Eleanor, eager to please, took a sip. The flavor was sharp, bitter beneath its sweetness, but she drank without question, thanking Margaret with a grateful nod. An hour later, as snow began to drift against the windows, Eleanor excused herself from the dance floor. A sudden weariness had overtaken her, a heaviness in her limbs that made her steps falter. Guests noticed her pallor as she clutched at her stomach, her smile wavering as she assured them she was simply tired. Jonathan guided her upstairs to a chamber prepared for the couple, his voice low with concern. By midnight, the household was in chaos. Eleanor's condition had worsened with alarming speed. She retched violently, her body convulsing, her skin clammy and pale. Jonathan knelt beside her, helpless, calling for the doctor, while Margaret stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable in the flickering candlelight. Neighbors summoned whispered it was food poisoning, perhaps an unfortunate spoilage in the kitchen. But some noticed the way Margaret's hand tightened on the banister, her lips pressed thin as she watched her new daughter-in-law ready upon the bed. The physician arrived, his black bag swinging as he hurried through the snow. He administered tinctures, but nothing eased the bride's agony. Eleanor's cries pierced the night, echoing down the stairwell until, in the small hours of morning, her voice fell silent. Jonathan's weeping carried through the house, the sound of a man broken at the threshold of happiness. Rumors began at once. Hartford was not a large city, and news of the tragedy spread with the speed of a winter gale. Some said the bride had fallen victim to a sudden illness, a weakness of the stomach that no doctor could mend. Others whispered darker theories, pointing to the tension between mother and bride, the strange cordial offered by Margaret, the cold detachment in her eyes. No accusation was spoken openly, but suspicion took root like frost creeping over glass. The funeral was held days later, the church once again filled with mourners. Eleanor's body lay pale in her coffin, her beauty preserved in stillness. Jonathan stood at her side gaunt with grief, while Margaret held her handkerchief with impeccable composure. Neighbors observed that not once did her tears fall, though her face was arranged in the likeness of sorrow. In the weeks that followed, Hartford's society buzzed with speculation. Some servants whispered of powders kept locked in Margaret's chest, of strange herbs purchased from apothecaries under the guise of household remedies. The doctor, though cautious, confided to Samuel Channing that Eleanor's symptoms bore resemblance to poisoning. Still no formal inquiry was launched, for the Channing name carried weight, and few dared speak against it. Yet Jonathan was not blind. In his grief, fragments of memory returned to him, the bitter taste Eleanor described, the way his mother's eyes had lingered too long, the unyielding disapproval she had voiced in hushed arguments. A seed of suspicion grew within him, one he could neither ignore nor uproot. The love he bore his mother warred with the anguish of his loss, until he found himself trapped between duty and truth. Jonathan could not rest in the weeks that followed. His days became hollow, his nights broken by dreams of Eleanor's final gasps, her delicate hands clutching at his sleeve while he stood powerless. He haunted the room where she had died, pacing the floorboards until they creaked under his weight. Servants tried to offer comfort, but their pity was met with silence. Friends called upon him, but he shut them away, preferring solitude to conversation. The one person who continued to visit was his mother, and her presence struck him with both relief and dread. Margaret moved through the house with the poise of a woman untouched by grief. She maintained appearances, attended church as if nothing had changed, and greeted callers with polite sorrow. Yet in private, her conversations with Jonathan were sharpened with subtle admonitions. "You must not let despair consume you, my son," she would say, her voice calm, her eyes cold. Eleanor was not strong. Her constitution was frail from the start. Providence has spared you greater suffering down the road. Each time she spoke thus, Jonathan's stomach turned. The words were meant to console, yet they carried a strange detachment, as though Eleanor's death had been a necessary correction. Jonathan remembered how Eleanor's cheeks had glowed with health before their vows, how her laughter had filled the garden. Frail. No, she had been vibrant, until that final night. One evening, as snow fell heavy against the window panes, Jonathan found himself in his mother's private sitting room, a place few entered uninvited. Margaret had left in haste to answer a caller, and Jonathan, restless, wandered near her writing desk. His hand brushed against a small locked box carved from walnut. A faint scent clung to it, sharp and metallic, like ground herbs mixed with something bitter. The key was nowhere in sight, but the presence of that box struck him like a blow. He thought of Eleanor's cordial, the way her lips had curled at its taste, and he felt his pulse quicken. The next day he visited the apothecary under pretense of purchasing laudanum for his sleeplessness. He inquired casually about remedies and powders. The apothecary, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, mentioned certain substances known for their potency, some beneficial in small doses, others deadly if misused. Arsenic, for example, he said, lowering his voice. A common household item, white powder tasteless when mixed with sweet wine. Used for rats, though I hesitate to sell it too freely. Too many accidents, you see. Jonathan felt his mouth go dry. He asked no further questions, but carried the knowledge home like a stone in his chest. The more he observed his mother, the more her every action seemed colored by menace. He recalled the stiffness in her smile when Eleanor first visited, the clipped remarks disguised as advice, the way her hand had pressed the glass into Eleanor's. He struggled against these thoughts, ashamed of suspecting the woman who had raised him, yet unable to silence the growing certainty that Eleanor's death had not been fate. Hartford society began to whisper louder. At teas and suppers, behind lace fans and closed doors, the tale spread that young Mrs. Channing had been poisoned. Some pointed fingers at a jealous rival, others at a disgruntled servant, but many fixed their suspicions on Margaret. They recalled her disapproval of the match, her cold manner, her lack of visible mourning. Still, none dared speak it openly, for the Channing name commanded respect, and Samuel's influence was not to be challenged lightly. One neighbor, Mrs. Lydia Harrow, confided in hushed tones to a friend that she had once seen Margaret purchasing odd vials at the apothecary, claiming they were for pest control. "But I swear," Mrs. Harrow whispered. The look in her eye was not that of a woman intent on killing rats. It was something colder. The rumor wound its way through parlors and taverns, taking on a life of its own, until even the servants repeated it in the kitchens. Jonathan's torment grew unbearable. At last, he confronted his father. One evening in the study, surrounded by the scent of pipe smoke and ledgers, he spoke. "Father, do you believe Mother could have had a hand in Eleanor's death?" The question hung heavy in the air. Samuel's face hardened, and for a long while he said nothing. Then, in a low voice, he replied, "You will not speak such words again. Your mother is a Channing. Whatever you suspect, bury it. Do you understand?" "But father—" "No." Samuel's fist struck the arm of his chair. "This house will not be divided by baseless accusations. Eleanor's death was tragic, but it was illness, nothing more. You dishonor your wife's memory and this family by suggesting otherwise." Jonathan fell silent, but the rebuke did not extinguish his doubts. Instead, it deepened his isolation. With his father unwilling to listen, and his mother cloaked in icy composure, he felt as though the walls of the house themselves conspired to suffocate him. The months dragged on. Winter thawed into spring, yet Jonathan's grief remained frozen in place. He began to avoid his mother's company, slipping from rooms when she entered, declining her attempts at conversation. Margaret noticed, of course, and her patience wore thin. One evening she cornered him in the corridor, her voice low and edged with steel. "You are my son. You will not shame this family with your brooding or your suspicions. Whatever thoughts fester in your mind, you will silence them. Do you understand?" Jonathan met her gaze, and for the first time in his life, he did not bow beneath it. "If you loved me," he said, his voice trembling, "you would never have harmed her." A flicker passed through Margaret's eyes, surprise, perhaps even fear, before she composed herself. "Grief has unhinged you," she said coldly. "Rest, and these fantasies will fade." Then she turned and walked away, her skirts whispering over the floorboards. But Jonathan knew what he had seen in that brief flicker. It was not the look of an innocent woman. It was the shadow of guilt, however swiftly concealed. He resolved then to seek the truth, no matter the cost. Quietly, he arranged for Eleanor's body to be exhumed, under the guise of moving her remains to the Price family plot in Providence. He enlisted the help of Eleanor's brother, Thomas Price, who had long harbored suspicions of his own. Together they secured the services of a physician willing to examine the body, discreetly and without the Channings' knowledge. The night before the exhumation, Jonathan lay awake, staring at the ceiling as the house slept around him. He thought of Eleanor's smile, the warmth of her hand in his, the way she had whispered his name on their wedding night before pain tore the words from her lips. He prayed that he might finally uncover what had stolen her from him, even as dread coiled in his chest. When the grave was opened and the examination conducted, the results confirmed what Jonathan had feared: traces of arsenic in Eleanor's remains, unmistakable and damning. The physician, pale with the weight of his discovery, urged discretion, for to accuse Margaret Channing outright would ignite scandal of ruinous proportions. Yet Jonathan could not remain silent. He carried the knowledge like fire, burning within him, consuming every hesitation. He knew the truth now. Eleanor had not died of chance or frailty. She had been murdered, and the hand that had poured the poison belonged to his own mother. Jonathan had expected to feel relief when the physician confirmed his worst fears. Instead, he felt hollow, as though the knowledge had carved something vital from him. Eleanor's death was no longer a tragic mystery. It was an act of deliberate malice. The certainty of it pressed down on him like a coffin lid. He walked the streets of Hartford with the look of a haunted man, his eyes sunken, his shoulders bent. Those who passed him whispered that grief had driven him mad. Perhaps it had. Thomas Price urged him to act at once. "You cannot let this stand," Eleanor's brother said, his jaw tight with anger. "She killed my sister. There must be justice. If you hesitate, you are complicit." Jonathan listened, torn between the call of justice and the chains of family loyalty. To accuse his mother was to shatter everything he had known. It would not only destroy her, but ruin his father, disgrace his siblings, and blacken the Channing name. Hartford society thrived on respectability, and scandal of this magnitude would be remembered for generations. For days, Jonathan vacillated. He drafted letters to the magistrate only to burn them. He imagined standing in court, pointing his finger at his mother, and then imagined her gaze upon him, cold, unyielding, and somehow still commanding. The woman who had nursed him as a child, who had bound his wounds and corrected his manners, was the same woman who had poured death into Eleanor's glass. How could both truths exist? Meanwhile, Margaret carried on as though nothing had shifted. She hosted small teas, exchanged visits with neighbors, and resumed her usual routines. If she noticed her son's silent reproach, she gave no sign. But those who studied her closely might have seen a new edge to her watchfulness, as though she sensed the net tightening. Even if no one had spoken the accusation aloud, Hartford, too, felt the change. The whispers that once drifted like smoke now settled heavier in the air. Servants spoke of them in kitchens, merchants traded them over counters, and churchgoers murmured them between hymns. The bride was poisoned, some said. The mother, in law they say, never wanted her. Others shook their heads, unwilling to believe such wickedness could reside behind the walls of so respected a house. The community divided, suspicion gnawing at the edges of civility. One evening Jonathan was summoned to his father's study once more. Samuel sat rigid, his face drawn and weary. A letter lay open on the desk. Jonathan recognized it as Thomas Price's handwriting. His blood ran cold. "Your brother-in-law has written to me," Samuel said, his voice low with suppressed fury. "He accuses your mother of murder." "Murder, Jonathan. Do you know what this means?" Jonathan's throat tightened. "It means he seeks justice for his sister. It means," Samuel snapped, rising to his feet, "that he would drag this family through the filth of rumor and ruin. That he would see us disgraced before the whole of Hartford. And you." His eyes bored into his son. "You knew of this, did you not?" Jonathan could not answer. His silence was confirmation enough. Samuel's hand trembled on the back of his chair. "You will end this folly. Do you hear me? You will deny it. You will tell Thomas Price that his grief has turned to madness. We will hear no more of this." Jonathan met his father's gaze, and for the first time, he saw not strength but desperation. The proud patriarch of the Channing family was not defending his wife from truth, but clinging to reputation like a drowning man to driftwood. Jonathan left the study with his heart heavier than before. The tension soon reached a breaking point. Thomas Price, unwilling to remain silent, began to speak more openly. In taverns, in shops, to anyone who would listen, he declared his sister had been murdered by her husband's mother. He claimed evidence. He spoke of arsenic, of the physician's findings. His voice carried with the weight of vengeance, and Hartford began to listen. Margaret did not confront Thomas directly, but her composure grew colder, her movements sharper. She withdrew from public gatherings, claiming illness, though many suspected it was strategy rather than frailty. Jonathan, caught between two worlds, felt the eyes of the entire town upon him. To some, he was the grieving widower deserving of sympathy. To others, he was the son of a murderess, his silence a form of complicity. The strain took its toll. Jonathan's nights were plagued with visions, Eleanor reaching for him with hands blackened by poison, his mother standing at her bedside with a cup in hand, the townspeople jeering as he stood mute. He woke drenched in sweat, gasping for air, the weight of indecision crushing him. At last, he resolved to confront Margaret directly. It was late, the house quiet, when he entered her chamber. She sat before her vanity, brushing her dark hair streaked with silver, the candlelight glinting in the mirror. When she saw his reflection behind her, she set the brush aside. "You know," Jonathan said, his voice hoarse. Margaret turned slowly. "Know what, my son? That Eleanor was poisoned. That you gave her the glass. That you," his voice broke, "that you killed her." For a long moment, she regarded him in silence, her eyes unreadable. Then she spoke, her tone calm, almost tender. "I did what was necessary." Jonathan staggered as though struck. "Necessary? She was wrong for you." Margaret continued, her words measured, deliberate. "She would have weakened you, pulled you from your path. She was not of us. I saw it from the first moment, and I will not see my son ruined by a woman's charms." Jonathan's hands trembled. "You murdered her. You destroyed my life. I preserved it." Margaret corrected, rising to her feet. She placed a hand on his cheek, cold and firm. "One day you will see I acted from love." He recoiled as though her touch had burned him. "If this is love," he whispered, "then it is more monstrous than hate." Margaret's gaze hardened. "Be careful, Jonathan. Words spoken cannot be recalled. Remember whose blood runs in your veins." Jonathan fled the chamber, his heart hammering. Her confession, subtle yet undeniable, echoed in his mind. She had admitted it, justified it, twisted it into an act of devotion. And now the burden of what to do with that knowledge fell squarely on him. The following Sunday, Jonathan entered the church alone. The congregation turned as he walked down the aisle, his face pale but resolute. He stood before the altar, his voice steady though his hands shook. "I cannot keep silent any longer," he declared. "My wife, Eleanor Channing, was murdered, and the hand that did it was my mother's." Gasps filled the sanctuary. Some rose in protest, others in stunned silence. Margaret herself was absent, feigning indisposition at home, but word of her son's accusations spread before the candles were even extinguished. Hartford erupted in scandal. Families took sides, friendships strained, and the Channing name, once a pillar of respect, began to crack under the weight of suspicion and betrayal.